Case 078 is a 65-year-old man found on his own kitchen floor by his son. The right side of his face collapsed into a stranger's expression, his right arm refusing every command his brain sends it. His son says one word to the 911 dispatcher: stroke. By the time paramedics have him in the ambulance, 2 other people connected to this same case are already carrying the same invisible passenger inside them. Neither knows it yet. Neither has any symptoms serious enough to mention to a doctor. One of them never will. At the emergency room, the stroke team activates protocol before case 078 is even off the gurney. Time is the entire game. In a stroke case, the longer a clot blocks blood flow to part of the brain, the more of that brain dies permanently, which is why the first question isn't what's wrong, it's when did this start? That question is already a problem. He lives alone. His son doesn't know if he last spoke to him 2 hours ago or 12. Without a reliable last known well time, the clot-dissolving medication that works beautifully in the first few hours becomes too dangerous to risk. A CT scan confirms a clot lodged in an artery feeding the left side of his brain, sitting there long enough that the fastest treatment window has already closed. He's started on blood thinners and admitted to the stroke unit, where the team runs a full workup to find the source. An echocardiogram checks his heart for a clot origin normal. A carotid ultrasound checks the arteries in his neck for build-up clean. Blood work checks for clotting disorders that can sit dormant for decades before triggering a single event: nothing. One by one, every mechanism a neurologist would normally reach for gets ruled out, because, on paper, case 078 shouldn't be here. He's 65 but active, walks 4 mornings a week, doesn't smoke, has well-controlled blood pressure, and has taken a daily low-dose aspirin for 6 years, for exactly this reason. His last EKG, 4 months ago, showed a normal rhythm, no atrial fibrillation, the most common reason a healthy older adult suddenly throws a clot to the brain. Quick pause if you're new here. I open a file like this every week, and I genuinely appreciate you being here for the next one. Back to case 078. A lab value the admitting team almost skims past turns out to be the whole case. His blood is measurably thick, a hematocrit and blood urea-nitrogen ratio both pointing the same direction, severe dehydration. Blood isn't just fluid moving through a pipe. It's a suspension red cells and platelets floating in plasma that keeps everything gliding smoothly through narrow vessels. Strip enough plasma volume away and the remaining blood doesn't just get thicker in some loose sense. It becomes viscous, sluggish, and far more likely to let platelets clump together, a state called hemoconcentration, from the Latin concentrare, to gather toward a center. Even a daily aspirin, built to make platelets less sticky to each other, can be overwhelmed by blood that's simply too thick and too slow for that protection to keep up. His aspirin hadn't failed. His dehydration outran it. Dehydration this severe doesn't announce itself the way a heart attack does. There's no chest pain, no single alarming moment it shows up as tiredness, as feeling a little off, the kind of vague malaise that never quite clears the bar for a doctor's visit. Which leaves the real question of case 078. What dehydrated a healthy, active 65-year-old man badly enough to throw a stroke? His son provides the missing piece 2 days into the admission, almost apologetically. His father had mentioned in passing 10 days earlier that his stomach had been off. Cramping, some diarrhea, nothing urgent sounding. His father laughed it off, probably something from lunch at the senior centre. He said, a bug going around, it'd pass like it always did. It didn't pass. It came in waves for a week and a half, a bad day, 2 fine days, a bad day again, never quite alarming enough in the moment to justify a doctor, while it quietly drained fluid out of his body the entire time. A stool sample collected on hospital day 2 comes back clean on the standard panel, the one built to catch ordinary food poisoning bacteria. Nothing grows. This is usually where a chart like this gets closed, the diarrhea written off as unrelated and irrelevant. But an infectious disease consultant, aware of a state health advisory circulating through Michigan hospitals that month, orders one more specific test, a modified acid-fast stain. It requires a technician to search the sample by eye under a microscope for something that doesn't grow on culture plates at all, because it isn't a bacterium. Small, round, faintly textured spheres appear under the stain. Cyclospora cayetanensis, from the Greek kyklos, circle, and spora, seed. A single-celled parasite whose signature is a pattern almost no other foodborne illness produces. Symptoms that fade, then unpredictably cycle back for weeks. All from one exposure, no reinfection required. Case 078 hadn't had one bad week. He'd been intermittently, invisibly sick for nearly 2. and had assumed it was nothing worth mentioning. His case gets automatically reported to the county health department. Cyclospora is legally notifiable in Michigan, meaning every confirmed diagnosis funnels into the same state surveillance system, regardless of hospital. 4 days earlier, a 71-year-old woman, a regular at the same senior center who sits 3 tables from case 078, without either of them ever exchanging more than a wave, was admitted to a different hospital entirely after her daughter found her disoriented, unable to stand steady on her own feet. In the ER, her blood pressure had fallen low enough that the triage nurse rechecked the cuff twice, assuming a machine error before accepting the number. Her blood work told a related but distinct story: severe dehydration presenting as a dangerous blood pressure drop and early kidney injury. Her kidneys simply starved of the blood volume they need to filter properly. Left uncorrected another day, the injury would have moved from early to irreversible. Her daughter told the admitting team almost the same thing. Case 078's son told his: a stomach bug 2 weeks earlier, cramping that came and went, nothing that seemed worth an appointment. Same parasite, confirmed under the same stain by a technician in a different building who has no idea case 078 exists. Her report lands in the same state surveillance queue 4 days after his, and this is where a state epidemiologist reviewing the week's intake catches something the software alone wouldn't have flagged. Both patients, in the food history section of their intake forms, listed the same senior center as their most recent congregate meal site. 2 reports, filed by 2 hospitals that have never spoken to each other, sitting 1 page apart in her queue. 3 days after that, a third piece falls into place, almost by accident. A part-time kitchen volunteer at the centre, a woman in her 50s who serves lunch 2 mornings a week, and had also felt off for about a week without ever missing a shift, calls her sister, a nurse 2 states away, mostly to talk about an upcoming family visit. The stomach bug comes up in passing, the way these things do, a throwaway line at the end of a longer conversation about something else entirely. Her sister asks one question that changes everything. Had she heard about a stomach bug going around the centre? She hadn't. Nobody had mentioned it to her directly, and she hadn't thought to ask. The next morning, before her shift, she asks around the kitchen anyway, half expecting to feel foolish for bringing it up. She isn't. 2 other staff members had also been quietly sick over the same stretch of weeks, neither one connecting it to anything beyond a bad stretch of days, neither one aware the other was going through the same thing 3 feet away at the same steam table. The epidemiologist's flag had given the county 2 hospitalized patients tied to the same site enough to open a file, not necessarily enough to justify pulling a facility's delivery records on a holiday week with limited staff. The volunteer's 5-minute call to her sister is what turns that flag into an active investigation. Proof that whatever hit those 2 patients is still moving through the building right now in people who never got sick enough to show up in any hospital's numbers at all. County investigators run a structured case control interview, calling every attendee they can reach from the relevant 2 weeks, cross-referencing what people who got sick ate against what people who didn't. It's slow, and it depends on elderly attendees accurately recalling meals from weeks earlier, but it's often the only tool that works, because testing the food itself is far less reliable than it sounds. By the time anyone thinks to test a specific ingredient, that batch has usually already been served, thrown out, or replaced. Even when a suspect batch is still testable, Cyclospora oocysts, from the Greek oun, egg, and kistis, sit sparse and unevenly distributed through a shipment. A negative food test doesn't rule anything out, it just means the sample missed where the contamination actually was. The interviews converge on what the kitchen delivery logs already suggested: a mixed salad blend, served twice during the window, sourced from a regional produce distributor called Northline Fresh, which supplies senior centres, school cafeterias, and hospital kitchens across 3 counties. Here is where this stops being a story about bad luck. Records the county pulls during the Traceback show, Northline Fresh had received a formal FDA warning letter 14 months earlier after a routine inspection found the farm supplying its leafy greens, a single operation the company had relied on for over half its salad blend volume, was drawing irrigation water from a source that had tested positive for parasitic contamination twice in 1 growing season. The warning letter required corrective action within 90 days. Northline's on-file response was to reduce its irrigation water testing schedule from monthly to quarterly, citing cost, and to keep the farm as a primary supplier, because switching would have meant a temporary supply gap the company didn't want to absorb during its highest volume institutional contract season, the months when senior centres, school districts, and hospital kitchens across 3 counties placed their bulk produce orders. Internal purchasing records later reviewed by county investigators show the projected cost of qualifying a second supplier that year came to just under $60,000 in onboarding and testing fees. The cost of doing nothing came to zero on a spreadsheet, right up until it didn't. No one at Northline broke a law doing this. Quarterly testing was, technically, still within the letter's minimum requirement. That's the part worth sitting with. Every decision Northline made in the following 14 months was defensible on paper, filed correctly, signed off by someone whose job title included the word compliance, right up until an elderly man lost partial use of the right side of his face because a contaminated shipment made it through a gap the company had every resource to close and chose, in writing, not to. Here's what a warning letter actually is, legally: a notice, not a punishment. The FDA can require a company to describe its corrective action, but it has no built-in mechanism to verify that the action taken matches what was promised, and no automatic penalty if it doesn't. Enforcement beyond the letter requires a follow-up inspection, a referral, or a new complaint, each one a separate, resource-limited event that has to be initiated by someone on top of an already backlogged list. A warning letter closes a file. It doesn't close a gap. This kind of failure has played out before. In 1996, over 1,400 confirmed Cyclospora cases across the US and Canada were traced back to raspberries imported from Guatemala, a traceback that took months of working backward from hundreds of scattered, seemingly unrelated cases toward one contaminated irrigation source. In 2013, more than 600 people across the Midwest were sickened by a bagged salad mix distributed to grocery stores, restaurants, and institutional kitchens alike, a supply chain broad enough that no single distributor could initially be isolated as the source. The pattern repeats because the incentive hasn't changed. Cyclospora doesn't spread person to person. Every case originates from contaminated produce, and the oocysts responsible can't even cause a new infection until they've matured outside the human body, in soil or water, over 1 to 2 weeks. That built-in delay means the responsible batch has almost always been fully distributed and eaten by the time the first case is even diagnosed, let alone traced back to a company's cost decision made over a year earlier. Case 078 spends 6 days in the stroke unit. His speech slowly improves, but the right side of his face doesn't fully recover its former mobility, and his son notices, months later, that his father still searches for certain words mid-sentence in a way he never used to. The parasite itself clears within about a week on trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole, the easiest part of his entire hospitalization to treat. The 71-year-old woman recovers her kidney function almost completely over the following month. The kitchen volunteer is never hospitalized and never lab confirmed, because she never sought care in the first place. One of what health officials openly acknowledge is a much larger, invisible layer of mild cases sitting beneath every reported outbreak number, including this one. Northline Fresh issued a voluntary recall of the implicated salad blend 11 days after the county traceback named them, switched suppliers for that product line within the month, and faced no fine because the corrective action letter they'd technically complied with had no enforcement teeth beyond the paperwork itself. The press release framed the recall as an abundance of caution. It did not mention the 14-month-old warning letter, the reduced testing schedule, or the $60,000 figure that had, on paper, made this outbreak the cheaper option. As of this recording, Michigan's confirmed Cyclospora case count for the summer sits well over 1,000, part of a cluster spreading across roughly 30 states nationally. There is no rapid test that can screen a truck full of lettuce for this parasite before it reaches a senior center's steam table, a school cafeteria's salad bar, or a grocery store shelf. The only tools that exist are slow ones, a technician staining a sample under a microscope days after someone first gets sick, and an epidemiologist piecing together a cluster from a volunteer's phone call to her sister. The gap between how fast a warning letter gets filed and how fast a company actually changes what it's doing hasn't closed since 1996. Case 078 fell into that gap this summer. So did a woman he shared a lunch line with for years without learning her name, and a kitchen volunteer whose case will never officially exist in any database at all, whose only record of ever having been sick is a phone call her sister happened to remember accurately. None of this gets solved without 3 separate people doing the part of the job that isn't required of them. An infectious disease consultant who orders one more test instead of closing the chart, a state epidemiologist who reads 2 intake forms closely enough to notice the same senior center listed twice, and a kitchen volunteer who mentions a stomach bug to her sister instead of shrugging it off. The county's official report credits all 3. Northline Fresh's warning letter is still on file, technically closed out. Case closed.